starting here at NASA headquarters, moving to our centers, and questions via the phone. Now it's my pleasure and honor to turn it over to our facilitator for the presentations, the program scientist for Messenger here at NASA headquarters, Marilyn Lindstrom. Marilyn?
Thank you, Dwayne. On October 6th, the Messenger mission had a very successful flyby of Mercury. The main purpose of this flyby, of course, was to have a trajectory correction to help us to get into orbit later. We were highly precise on this. We were 0.6 kilometers of the 200-kilometer altitude target. All 7 instruments were on, operated flawlessly. They returned 650 megabytes of data, 1,287 images, and mapped another 30% of the planet that had never been seen before. The image you've been looking at is one that's pretty familiar. It was the first downloaded and released on October 7th. Now you're going to get to see a whole lot more of what we've been doing over the last 3 weeks, as the science team tells you its results. To speak to us today, we have Brian Anderson, who is the Deputy Project Scientist from Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, or APL, that runs the mission for us. Ron Vervac, also from APL. Maria Zuber, co-investigator from MIT, and Mark Robinson from Arizona State University. And to start off, we're going to talk about the dynamic environment around Mercury. Brian and Ron will tell you about the measurements from our magnetometer and our UV-Vis spectrometer. Brian, you take it over?
Sure. Thank you, Marilyn. The exciting thing about the second flyby from a magnetic field standpoint at Mercury is that we were able to obtain measurements for the very first time from the western hemisphere of the planet. The graphic that you're looking at shows the paths from which we have magnetometer data suitable for understanding the intrinsic field of the planet. And you'll notice that the second flyby of Messenger is the only one that provides data for east longitudes greater than 180 degrees, that is in the western hemisphere. So in the next graphic, I show the magnetic fields that were observed, the magnitude of the magnetic fields observed on Messenger's first and second flyby. And what you notice is that the maximum magnetic field, and that's a measure of the intensity of the planetary magnetic field, those maxima were almost identical between the first and the second flyby. They agreed to within almost 2%. That's very significant because even though they were on opposite hemispheres of the planet, they observed almost exactly the same magnitude field. That means that the planetary's magnetic moment is very much centered on the planet's rotation axis, and it also means that the orientation of the planet's magnetic moment is very tightly aligned with the rotation axis of the planet to within about 2 degrees. For comparison, Earth's magnetic field is tilted by 11 degrees relative to the rotation axis. Well, even though the magnetic fields were similar, there was a significant difference between the first flyby and the second one, and I illustrate that in the second graphic. The second graphic shows the angle between the magnetic field and north observed for the first flyby and the second flyby as the spacecraft was outbound from the region controlled by Mercury's magnetic field, the magnetosphere, back into the solar wind. And at that crossing, you notice in the first flyby, the magnetic field remained northward, indicating that that was the direction of the solar wind magnetic field at that time. For the second flyby, the magnetic field turned strongly southward as we crossed that magnetopause boundary and remained southward, indicating that we had a southward solar wind magnetic field at the time of the second flyby. The reason that's so important is illustrated on the next graphic, which shows the magnetic lines of force that we would expect to find as they would be configured in the dawn-dusk meridian plane as viewed from the sun. For a southward solar wind field, you notice that the solar wind field is directly connected with the planet's magnetic field and actually provides direct access to the surface of the planet over large regions of the north and the southern polar regions of the planet. For a northward solar wind magnetic field, there's very little interaction between the planetary magnetic field and the solar wind, so there's much less access of material from the solar wind to the surface of the planet. During the second flyby, we saw numerous examples of strong interaction and strong dynamics between the solar wind and Mercury's magnetic field. And I want to show you one of those in the animation. In this animation, I'll be zooming in on the outbound crossing of the magnetopause. You can see the dots there are showing the time for which we're showing the heading there in the lower right. And there it's crossing the magnetopause where the field is turning from north to south And at the same time it crossed the magnetopause, there was a very strong pointing of the magnetic field towards the planet, which was very surprising. You'll see this run again. Pay attention to that. As we're coming up to the magnetopause, the field is northward, and you'll see it start to turn south. There it goes south, and there it's pointing actually toward the planet, very strongly towards the planet. At all magnetopause crossings we've observed at other planets, we've never seen a magnetic field pointed anywhere near that strongly across the magnetopause. And that indicates that the energy transfer during this encounter was perhaps 100 times greater in intensity than it is at the Earth, meaning that the total energy transfer into Mercury's magnetic field region was perhaps the equivalent of, say, 100 medium-sized power plants. And that energy is channeled along the magnetic lines of force to the surface of the planet, where it has a number of consequences, one of which is populating the neutral tenuous atmosphere around the planet. And my colleague, Dr. Ron Vervaek, is now going to talk about observations that were made of that environment around Mercury.
Okay, thanks, Brian. What I'm going to talk about is the very tenuous atmosphere of Mercury, which we refer to as the exosphere. And the primary instrument on MESSENGER for studying the exosphere is the Mercury Atmospheric and Surface Composition Spectrometer, or MASS for short. And the way MASS works is it basically scans through the ultraviolet and visible portion of the wavelength spectrum, and it searches for emissions from the atoms and molecules that make up the exosphere. So if I can have my first slide, please. What this shows are typical observations of calcium and sodium in the exosphere of Mercury that MASS obtained during the second flyby. And these are what we call spectral lines. And the colored portions under the histograms are essentially the emission intensity at a particular wavelength. And because atoms of a given species only emit light at a certain wavelength, or certain wavelengths, depending on the species, these are a unique fingerprint of the atoms that are doing the emitting. And for sodium, this occurs in the yellow portion of the visible spectrum. And for calcium, the wavelength is in the blue part of the visible spectrum. And now, both sodium and calcium have been observed from Earth using the ground-based telescopes. But during the second flyby, we got the first ever simultaneous observations of both sodium and calcium. And in a minute, I'll tell you why that's so important. If I can have the next slide, please. This shows you similar observations that we made of magnesium emission in the exosphere. And magnesium has its wavelength of emission in the ultraviolet. And because the Earth's atmosphere is basically opaque in the sense that it blocks or absorbs the UV radiation that's coming in from outer space, you cannot observe this particular emission from ground-based telescopes. So the MASS observations that we obtained this time are the first ever detection of magnesium in the exosphere of Mercury. And that's important because for a long time it's been expected that magnesium was a component of the surface of material of Mercury. The atoms that we see in the exosphere primarily originate in the surface, from the surface. They're released in various processes. And so the fact that we observe it in the exosphere means that magnesium is definitely a part of the Mercury surface. And that is one of the important reasons for studying the exosphere, is that it provides unique information on the surface material. Now, I'm going to show you some observations of extended tail emission that we made during the second flyby. And to set that up, I'm going to ask that we run a little animation. So what you're seeing here is the sun is on the left, and north is up, and the spacecraft is moving towards the planet from the right to the left. And as it's doing so, it's rotating about the Sun-Mercury line up and down, and basically doing sort of a push broom sweeping across the tail. So it's mapping out the spatial distribution of the sodium emissions. Now, each of these little boxes that you're seeing is an individual sodium observation. The color scale goes from dark to bright, where bright is relatively more emission. And once we have